There's a moment in every empire's history that historians can point to decades later and say that's when they should have known. Not the collapse itself, not even the crisis. The warning, the single, unmistakable signal that the system was breaking, that the foundation was crumbling, that everything they'd built was about to come apart. And here's what makes it terrifying. Every empire got the warning. Every single one. Rome got it, Spain got it, Britain got it, the Soviet Union got it. And every time the people in power looked at that warning and said, "This time is different, we're different. The old rules don't apply to us." They were wrong, every single time. In 410 AD, Rome had transformed dramatically from its productive past. By the late Empire, Romans enjoyed an extraordinary number of public holidays and festivals. Modern historians debate the exact count, with estimates ranging from 135 to over 150 days per year when public games, religious festivals, or imperial celebrations occurred. The grain dole, the annona, fed hundreds of thousands of people in the city of Rome at state expense. The government was dedicating enormous resources to public welfare and entertainment, while the military budget faced increasing constraints. And Roman senators, the people who could have changed course, dismissed anyone who raised concerns. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the late 4th century, documented the decadence and dysfunction of the Roman elite who believed Rome's wealth was eternal. 3 years after the criticisms Ammianus recorded, Alaric the Visigoth sacked Rome. The city that hadn't fallen to a foreign army in 800 years burned for 3 days. In 1588, Spain controlled an empire where the sun never set. Silver from the mines of Potosí in modern-day Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico flowed into Spanish coffers in staggering quantities. Between 1500 and 1650, Spanish America produced over 150,000 tons of silver. At its peak in the late 16th century, Spain was receiving the equivalent of several 100,000 kilograms of silver annually. Philip II had built the most powerful military in Europe. The Spanish Armada was the largest fleet ever assembled, and yet Spain was bankrupt, not struggling financially, legally bankrupt. Philip II declared sovereign debt defaults in 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596. 4 times during his reign, Spain suspended payments to creditors despite unprecedented wealth flowing in from the Americas. The warning was obvious to contemporary observers. All that silver was flowing straight through Spain to pay foreign creditors and import manufactured goods from the Netherlands, Italy, and France. Spain was producing very little domestically. The arbitristas, Spanish economic reformers of the late 16th and early 17th centuries, explicitly warned that importing inflation while exporting productive capacity was destroying Spain's economic foundation. When Spanish economists like Martín González de Celorrigo and Sancho de Moncada warned that the empire was hollowing out, that they were importing finished goods and exporting raw materials, Philip and his successors ignored them. Within 40 years of Philip's death in 1598, Spain had gone from the world's dominant power to a second-tier kingdom engaged in a ruinous 30 years war that would bankrupt the empire further. In 1913, Britain controlled approximately 1/4 of the world's land surface and nearly 1/4 of the world's population through the British Empire. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. The Royal Navy dominated every ocean. And at the height of this power, British economists were already warning about fundamental structural problems. Britain was the world's largest creditor nation, with an estimated £4 billion invested overseas by 1914. But British industry was losing ground to Germany and America in key sectors. By 1913, Britain had fallen to 3rd place behind the United States and Germany in steel production. Britain produced 7.7 million tons of steel annually, while Germany produced 17 million tons and America produced 31 million tons. British factories were aging. Investment was flowing overseas rather than into domestic industry modernization. J.A. Hobson published Imperialism, a Study in 1902. Arguing that Britain's focus on financial returns from empire was undermining domestic industrial capacity. Britain was living off returns from overseas investments, while its manufacturing base eroded. British leaders dismissed these concerns. Britain has ruled the waves for over a century. They said, "Our financial position is unassailable. The City of London is the world's financial center." 1 year later, World War I began. By 1918, Britain had borrowed so heavily to finance the war that it owed the United States over $4 billion. Britain had transformed from the world's largest creditor to a major debtor nation. The pound never fully recovered its position as the unchallenged global reserve currency. The empire began its long decline. In 1985, the Soviet Union was a nuclear superpower with the world's largest military. According to the Federation of American Scientists, the Soviet nuclear arsenal peaked at approximately 45,000 warheads in 1986. They controlled Eastern Europe through the Warsaw Pact. They had client states on every continent. And beneath that facade of strength, the entire system was deteriorating. Soviet economists knew it. Internal government reports, including those prepared for the Central Committee, documented that industrial productivity growth had declined from over 6% annually in the 1950s to under 2% by the 1980s. Technology was falling behind the West in critical sectors. The command economy was producing enormous waste. In 1983, classified reports to General Secretary Yuri Andropov warned that the Soviet Union could not sustain military spending at 16 to 17% of GDP, the actual burden according to CIA estimates, without severe economic consequences. The reports were shelved. Military spending continued. In 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, adding an estimated $5 billion annually to military expenditures. When Mikhail Gorbachev took power in 1985 and attempted reforms through glasnost and perestroika, the system was already past the point of salvageable reform. 6 years later, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. 4 empires, 4 warnings, 4 times the warning was ignored, and 4 times the empire collapsed in ways that contemporary observers had explicitly predicted. But here's what makes this pattern so important. The warning isn't random, it's not different each time. It follows a consistent pattern, the same fundamental signal appearing in similar ways at similar points in every empire's decline. And once you see what the warning actually is, once you understand what it's really telling you, you'll recognize it throughout history and in the present. Because the United States is exhibiting the same warning signals right now, the same structural shifts that appeared before Rome, Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union declined. And just like every empire before, many voices in power are saying, this time is different, we're different, the old rules don't apply to us. Let me show you what the warning actually is, what it means, why every empire ignored it, and why the pattern suggests what comes next. Before we identify the specific warning, you need to understand what all these empires had in common at their peak. Because the warning doesn't appear when an empire is weak. It appears when the empire looks strongest, when everyone believes the system is permanent, when collapse seems impossible. Rome in the 2nd century AD, absolute military dominance. The Pax Romana, the empire stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. Trade flourished, cities grew, Rome seemed eternal. And beneath that prosperity, structural changes were occurring that would prove fatal. Spain in 1580, the height of Spanish power. The Armada was being built, silver flowing from the New World in unprecedented quantities. The Spanish Empire was the wonder of Europe, and the arbitristas were already documenting the hollowing out of Spanish industry. Britain in 1900, the Victorian and Edwardian era at its apex. The British Empire covered approximately 13 million square miles. The pound sterling backed by gold-dominated international trade. Britain seemed invincible, and British economists were documenting the loss of industrial competitiveness to Germany and America. The Soviet Union in 1970. Nuclear parity with the United States achieved. Eastern Europe appeared locked down. The Soviet system looked stable for generations, and internal economic reports were documenting stagnant productivity and unsustainable military burdens. The pattern is consistent. The warning comes when success has created complacency, when the elite believe the system is too powerful to fail, when the population trusts that prosperity is permanent. That's the moment of maximum danger, because that's when nobody wants to hear that the foundation is cracking. So what is the warning? It's not military defeat. That comes later as a symptom. It's not economic collapse. That's the result, not the warning itself. It's not political dysfunction. That's a consequence, not the root cause. The warning is this: the empire shifts from being a net producer of essential goods to being a net consumer, dependent on external production. Physical goods, the things people actually need to survive and fight. Food, manufactured items, military equipment, weapons, start being imported from outside the empire's direct control, while the empire's internal economy increasingly focuses on services finance, administration, and the consumption of goods produced elsewhere. Let me show you how this played out 4 times with the historical evidence. Rome. In the 1st century AD, Italy was largely self-sufficient in food production. The Po Valley and Campania were productive agricultural regions. Roman artisans and workshops produced most of the goods consumed in the empire. Yes, Rome imported luxuries like silk from China via the Silk Road and spices from India, but Rome produced the essentials domestically. By the 3rd century AD, this had fundamentally changed. Italy had largely ceased growing enough grain to feed itself. Archaeological evidence and historical records show that grain was increasingly imported from Egypt, which supplied much of Rome's needs, and from North Africa. The Annona system, the state grain distribution, depended almost entirely on imports, primarily from Egypt and Africa Proconsularis. Why had Italy stopped growing grain? Because wealthy landowners found it more profitable to consolidate land into large estates called latifundia that produced wine, olive oil, and other cash crops for export rather than grain for local consumption. The economic logic was clear. Imported grain from Egypt was cheaper than growing it in Italy, so land was diverted to more profitable uses. Weapons production also shifted. By the 4th century, the Notitia Dignitatum, an administrative register of the late Roman Empire, lists weapons factories called fabricae located across the empire, from Gaul to the Balkans, but notably fewer in Italy itself. The production of arms had moved to the provinces. The Roman elite had shifted their wealth from productive investments in agriculture and manufacturing to unproductive assets like urban real estate in Rome and loans to the government. Wealth concentration increased dramatically. By the late empire, a small senatorial aristocracy owned vast estates across multiple provinces, while the urban population depended on state distributions of imported grain. The warning was documented by contemporary observers. Several Roman writers noted the dependency on Egyptian grain. The Emperor Vespasian allegedly said that whoever controlled Egypt controlled Rome's food supply. This wasn't a strength. It was a critical vulnerability when Germanic tribes disrupted trade routes in the 4th and 5th centuries, and when the Vandals conquered North Africa in the 430s, cutting off grain supplies. Italy faced recurring famines. The productive capacity to feed the population had been allowed to atrophy. The empire that had once produced everything had become dependent on imported essentials. Spain. In 1520, before the full flood of American silver began, Spain was a relatively poor but productive country. Spanish agriculture fed the population. Spanish craftsmen produced goods. Spanish forges made weapons and tools. Spain was economically behind the Netherlands, Italy, and France, but it was largely self-sufficient. Then the silver began flowing in massive quantities. The Potosi mine in Bolivia, discovered in 1545, became the richest silver deposit in history. Zacatecas in Mexico produced enormous quantities. Conservative estimates suggest that between 1500 and 1650, Spanish America exported over 150,000 tons of silver, with the peak flows occurring in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. What happened? Spanish agriculture declined. Why farm wheat when you could buy grain imported from Sicily or the Baltic with American silver? Spanish manufacturing collapsed. Why produce textiles when you could import better quality cloth from the Netherlands or Flanders? Spanish craftsmen couldn't compete with foreign imports that were both cheaper and superior in quality. The arbitristas, economic reformers who wrote extensively between 1590 and 1650, documented this transformation in detail. Martin González de Celorigo wrote in 1600 that Spain had become a nation of consumers rather than producers. Sancho de Moncada wrote in 1619 that Spain was exporting raw materials, mainly silver and wool, and importing finished goods, creating exactly the pattern that would later be called an extractive economy. By 1630, Spain produced very little. The silver from America flowed into Spain through Seville and flowed right back out through other ports to pay foreign creditors and foreign manufacturers. Spain had become, in modern economic terms, a pass-through economy. Wealth flowed through but didn't accumulate productively. Spanish leaders knew this was happening. The Council of Castile received numerous reports warning about industrial decline. But responding would have required protectionist policies that would reduce the income of the merchant elite who profited from imports, and would have required decades of investment to rebuild industries that had atrophied. The short-term cost seemed too high. The silver kept flowing, so nothing changed. When Spain's enemies, primarily the Dutch and English, began capturing treasure fleets, and when silver production began declining after 1640, Spain faced a crisis. They had no production capacity to fall back on. No industrial base meant no ability to produce weapons or ships domestically at scale. Spain had all the silver in the world during its peak and still went bankrupt repeatedly because silver without production capacity is just expensive metal. Britain. In 1870, Britain was genuinely the workshop of the world. British factories produced approximately 50% of the world's iron and steel. British shipyards built roughly 60% of the world's ships. British textile mills dominated global markets. The Industrial Revolution had been born in Britain, and Britain still led. By 1900, Britain was losing ground. According to historical production statistics, Britain produced 5 million tons of steel in 1900. Germany produced 6.3 million tons. The United States produced 10 million tons. By 1913, the gap had widened further. Britain at 7.7 million tons. Germany at 17 million tons. America at 31 million tons. British industrial production hadn't declined in absolute terms. But relative to competitors, Britain was falling behind. German and American factories were newer, more efficient, and increasingly outcompeting British goods in global markets. But Britain was still wealthy. Actually, wealthier than ever measured by national income. How? Returns on overseas investments. British investors had spent the 19th century building railroads in Argentina, mines in South Africa, plantations in India, factories across the empire. By 1913, Britain had approximately £4 billion invested overseas, generating an estimated £200 million annually in investment income. This was substantial, roughly 8% of British GDP. The British economy had shifted composition. Financial services, insurance, and shipping services grew. Manufacturing employment as a percentage of the workforce began declining. London consolidated its position as the world's financial center. The pound sterling, backed by gold at a fixed rate, was the currency of international trade. Britain looked dominant, but several economists warned this was an unstable foundation. J.A. Hobson, in Imperialism, a study published in 1902, argued that Britain was becoming a rentier nation, living off past investments rather than building new productive capacity. He warned that financial wealth without industrial capacity would prove inadequate in a crisis. British leaders dismissed these concerns. Britain's financial position seemed unassailable. The Bank of England held the world's largest gold reserves. British banks financed global trade. Manufacturing, they argued, was moving to a new phase where Britain would specialize in high-value services while allowing others to handle basic manufacturing. World War I exposed the flaw in this reasoning. Britain needed industrial production at unprecedented scale and discovered serious limitations. Britain couldn't produce enough artillery shells, leading to the shell crisis of 1915. Britain couldn't build ships fast enough to replace submarine losses. Britain had to rely heavily on American production to sustain the war effort. After the war, Britain never recovered industrial dominance. The financial wealth remained for a while, but the productive capacity had moved to Germany, America, and eventually Japan. When the Great Depression hit, Britain couldn't produce its way out of crisis. The industries had moved elsewhere. The empire that had once made everything now made increasingly little relative to global production. The decline was terminal, though it took decades to fully manifest. The Soviet Union. In 1950, the Soviet Union was rapidly industrializing under Stalin's 5-year plans. Steel production grew from 18 million tons in 1950 to 91 million tons by 1965. The Soviets were obsessed with production quotas. Heavy industry, tractors, machine tools, weapons. The entire propaganda system celebrated production. By 1970, something fundamental had changed. Growth rates were declining. According to CIA estimates that have been largely confirmed by post-Soviet data, Soviet GDP growth fell from approximately 5 to 6% annually in the 1950s to 3 to 4% in the 1960s to 2 to 3% in the 1970s. Innovation had stagnated. Soviet factories still produced, but the goods were increasingly obsolete compared to Western equivalents. More significantly, the Soviet economy had become heavily dependent on raw material exports. Oil and natural gas discoveries in Siberia became the foundation of Soviet export earnings. By the 1970s, energy exports to Western Europe provided crucial hard currency that the Soviet Union used to import grain and consumer goods. For a nation that had prided itself on self-sufficiency, this represented a fundamental failure. The Soviet Union, with some of the world's richest agricultural land in Ukraine and southern Russia, was importing grain from the United States, Canada, and Argentina. Soviet agriculture, crippled by collectivization and mismanagement, couldn't feed the population adequately. Soviet economists documented these problems in classified reports. The CIA obtained some of these through intelligence channels. The reports warned that productivity growth was unsustainably low, that technology was falling behind the West critically in computers and electronics, and that military spending at 16 to 17% of GDP was crushing the economy's ability to produce consumer goods. The Soviet leadership knew they faced a structural crisis, but responding would have required fundamental economic reforms that threatened the power of the Communist Party. Instead, they relied on oil and gas exports to patch over the problems. When oil prices were high in the 1970s, this worked. Soviet revenue funded imports of grain and consumer goods, maintaining living standards without structural reform. Then came 1986. Oil prices collapsed from $31 per barrel in November 1985 to below $10 per barrel by July 1986. Soviet export revenue collapsed. Suddenly, they couldn't afford to import grain or consumer goods. The economy, which had been barely functional, seized up. Food shortages appeared. Consumer goods became scarce. The Soviet Union discovered they'd let their productive capacity atrophy. They could extract oil and gas, but they couldn't produce the consumer goods, the electronics, the machinery their population needed and expected. They had to import everything, but now they had nothing valuable to export except energy at collapsed prices. When Gorbachev tried to reform the system through perestroika, he discovered the industrial base was so deteriorated, so technologically backward, so riddled with inefficiency, that reform couldn't save it. The empire that had prided itself on being a workers' state had become dependent on extracting raw materials from the ground and selling them abroad while importing finished goods. It was an extractive economy pattern typically associated with underdeveloped nations, not superpowers. 4 empires. 4 times the same fundamental pattern. Production shifted from inside the empire to outside. The elite concentrated wealth in financial assets, land or extraction, rather than productive investments. The empire became dependent on imports for essentials, while exports shifted to raw materials, financial services, or simply payment in the form of assets like government bonds. And every single time when economists or thoughtful observers pointed this out, the response was the same. This time is different. We're wealthier than ever. Look at our financial markets. Look at our assets. Look at our gold and silver. We don't need to make things anymore. We're beyond that. That's for less developed nations. Until the crisis came. And then they discovered that financial wealth without productive capacity is nearly worthless in a real emergency. You can't eat treasury bonds. You can't arm soldiers with stock certificates. You can't build factories with real estate deeds. Production capacity is the foundation of real power. Everything else is built on that foundation. When the foundation erodes, the structure eventually collapses. Now let me show you why this warning is so consistently ignored. Because understanding why empires ignore the warning is the key to understanding why the pattern repeats across completely different cultures and time periods. The problem is that the warning appears when everything looks great by conventional measures. Rome in the 2nd century was wealthy. Spain in 1580 was wealthy. Britain in 1900 was wealthy. The Soviet Union in 1970 looked stable. These weren't empires in obvious decline. They were empires at or near the height of their power, at least by the measures people were using at the time. Here's what happens psychologically and economically. When an empire starts shifting from production to consumption, from making things to importing them while specializing in services or finance, there's an initial boom that makes the shift seem wise. Let me show you the mechanism. Take Rome. When Italy stopped growing as much grain domestically and started importing from Egypt, that freed up Italian land for other uses. Large estates producing wine and olive oil for export, urban villas for the wealthy. The elite got richer because imported grain was often cheaper than growing it domestically due to Egypt's extraordinary agricultural productivity. Food prices in Rome could actually fall. The urban population was happy because bread was cheaper and more reliable. Everyone pointed to this as evidence of Rome's sophisticated economy. We don't have to toil growing grain like barbarians. The argument went, we have a well-organized empire that grows it more efficiently in Egypt and Africa and ships it to us. Nobody asked, what happens if we lose Egypt? What happens if the grain fleet is disrupted? What happens if the supply lines are cut? Because that seemed impossible. Rome had controlled Egypt since 30 BC under Augustus. Egypt was the most secure province. The idea that Rome might lose access to Egyptian grain seemed absurd. Until it wasn't. When Vandals under Genseric conquered North Africa in the 430s AD, they cut off grain supplies to Rome. Italy couldn't feed itself anymore. The fields had been converted to other uses. The infrastructure for large-scale grain production had deteriorated. The knowledge and systems for growing grain at scale had atrophied from disuse. Importing grain had seemed like efficiency and sophisticated economics. It turned out to be a dependency that became fatal when the system was disrupted. The same psychological and economic pattern occurred in Spain. When American silver started flowing in massive quantities, Spanish nobles and merchants stopped investing in productive enterprises. Why build a textile workshop when you can import superior cloth from Flanders with silver? Why invest in agriculture when you can buy grain from Sicily? Why develop manufacturing when everything you want can be purchased from the Netherlands, Italy, or France? This created a short-term boom in the living standards for those who had access to the silver. Spanish cities grew. Luxury goods flooded in. The Spanish court became the wealthiest and most splendid in Europe. Nobles built elaborate palaces. The elite were richer than ever in terms of consumption possibilities. And they pointed to this wealth as evidence that Spain's economic model was superior. We have the source of silver, they said. We can buy whatever we need. Production is tedious and low return. Let others manufacture. We'll consume. The arbitristas explicitly warned about this. Sancho de Moncada wrote in 1619 that Spain had many rich people, but a poor kingdom. He meant that individuals who controlled the silver flow were personally wealthy, but the nation as a whole was becoming poorer because it produced nothing. His warnings were ignored as pessimistic or unpatriotic. Nobody wanted to hear that dependence on imported goods meant Spain was vulnerable to any disruption in silver flows or any change in the terms of trade. That sounded like unnecessary worry. Until the silver flows began declining after 1640 due to declining production and increased interception by Spain's enemies. Until foreign manufacturers, knowing Spain had no domestic production alternatives, began raising prices. Then Spain discovered that all that silver had bought them nothing except decades of dependency. When this silver flow diminished, Spain faced crisis. No production capacity meant no way to replace what they'd been importing. Britain experienced a similar pattern in a different form. When returns from overseas investments began exceeding returns from domestic manufacturing in the late 19th century, British capital naturally flowed toward higher returns. Why invest in modernizing a factory in Manchester with uncertain returns when you could invest in an Argentine railroad that the British government would guarantee to pay 6% annually? Why deal with British labor unions when you could invest in South African mines with cheaper labor? British financiers and investors got wealthy. The City of London boomed. Financial services employment grew. Britain was earning enormous sums from overseas investments. And British leaders celebrated this as progress beyond crude manufacturing. We're evolving past the factory age, they said. Financial services and high-value services are the future. Let Germany and America compete in manufacturing. We'll manage the world's capital. Several economists warned this was unsustainable. They pointed out that financial wealth depends ultimately on productive capacity somewhere in the system. If Britain wasn't producing, and Britain's income came from financing other nations' production, then Britain was becoming a middleman rather than a producer. And middlemen are replaceable. If Germany or America could provide their own financial services, Britain's role would diminish. These warnings were dismissed as pessimism or failure to understand modern economics. Britain looked dominant. The pound was unchallenged. British banks financed global trade. Manufacturing seemed like yesterday's economy. Then World War I required massive domestic production, and Britain discovered what happened when you let industrial capacity atrophy for decades. Britain couldn't produce munitions, ships, or weapons at the scale needed without enormous difficulty. The shell crisis of 1915, when British artillery ran out of ammunition, revealed that Britain had let critical production capacity deteriorate. Meanwhile, Germany, despite being blockaded and outnumbered, kept fighting for 4 years because their industrial base was intact and more modern than Britain's. After the war, Britain couldn't rebuild industrial dominance. The skilled workers had moved to other industries or emigrated. The factories were obsolete. The institutional knowledge was gone. The capital that might have modernized British industry was invested overseas and couldn't easily be repatriated. Britain remained wealthy in financial terms for a while longer, but the foundation of productive capacity had moved elsewhere. The Soviet Union's version followed similar psychology with different specifics. When Soviet economic growth slowed dramatically in the 1970s, Soviet leadership faced a fundamental choice: undertake difficult, politically dangerous reforms to modernize the economy, introduce market mechanisms, and accept reduced Communist Party control, or exploit the oil boom of the 1970s to maintain living standards without reform. They chose oil. From 1973 to 1985, oil prices rose from roughly $3 per barrel to over $30, though with significant volatility. Soviet oil production increased from 7 million barrels per day to over 12 million barrels per day during this period. Revenue exploded. The Soviet Union could import grain from America and Canada, consumer goods from Eastern Europe and the West, and technology they couldn't produce domestically. Soviet planners were initially euphoric. They'd found a way to maintain living standards and military spending without painful reforms. They could paper over agricultural failures by importing food. They could satisfy consumer demand by importing goods. These structural problems could be ignored indefinitely as long as oil revenue remained high. Nobody in Soviet leadership wanted to hear that dependence on commodity exports made them vulnerable to price shocks. That sounded defeatist. We have vast natural resources, the argument went. Oil and gas will always be valuable. We're stronger than ever financially. We can afford to import what we need. This was the same argument Spanish nobles made about silver 400 years earlier. It was equally wrong. When oil prices collapsed in 1986, Soviet revenue collapsed with it. Suddenly, they couldn't afford to import grain, consumer goods, or technology, and they discovered they couldn't produce these things domestically either. Soviet industrial capacity had stagnated for 2 decades. Their factories produced inferior goods. Their agriculture was dysfunctional. They'd become dependent on imports financed by resource extraction. When resource prices fell, the entire system seized up. The pattern is always the same across all 4 empires. The shift from production to consumption and imports creates a short-term boom that makes the elite wealthier and makes the general population more comfortable through lower prices or greater variety. Everyone celebrates this as economic sophistication and progress. Anyone warning that declining domestic production and increasing import dependency creates strategic vulnerability gets dismissed as a pessimist who doesn't understand the new economy, who's stuck in old thinking, who doesn't appreciate how wealthier we've become. But the warning is correct every time. Because productive capacity is the foundation of real wealth and real power. Everything else, financial assets, accumulated gold and silver, real estate, commodity exports, returns on past investments, is built on that productive foundation. When the foundation erodes, the structure eventually collapses. It might take decades. The collapse might be slow or sudden, but it happens. Now here's where the pattern becomes truly dark. Because the elite who benefit most from this shift, who accumulate the most wealth during this period, they're not ignorant of the warnings. They see them. They often understand the risks better than anyone. But they ignore the warnings anyway, not because they don't believe them, because they've already positioned themselves to survive or even profit from the eventual collapse. Let me show you how this worked historically, because this is the mechanism that makes the warning almost inevitable to ignore in every empire. Rome. The senators who controlled Roman politics in the 3rd and 4th centuries weren't fools. They understood that Italy's dependence on Egyptian and African grain created vulnerability, but they personally owned vast estates across the empire. Their wealth was geographically diversified. They owned grain-producing estates in Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily. They owned estates producing wine in Gaul and Spain. They owned properties across the empire. When someone warned that Italy's dependence on imported grain was strategically dangerous, that Italy needed to restore domestic grain production capacity, the senators had no personal incentive to act. Imported grain was cheaper, which maximized their profit margins on their Italian estates that produced wine and olive oil instead of grain. Restoring Italian grain production would require investing in agriculture with lower returns and would compete with their own grain exports from Egypt and Africa. From their perspective, the current system was optimal. They were getting rich. If the system eventually broke down, they had estates outside Italy they could retreat to. They were insulated from the consequences. The Roman middle class, small farmers, and urban craftsmen saw their economic position deteriorate due to cheap imports and land consolidation. But they had no political power. The senators who did have power were profiting from the system and had geographical escape options if it collapsed. Spain. The Spanish nobility who controlled policy under Philip II and his successors went blind to Spain's economic problems. They read the Arbitristas reports. They understood that Spain was producing nothing and importing everything. But Spanish nobles had diversified their wealth internationally. They invested in Genoese banking houses that financed trade across Europe. They held shares in Portuguese spice trade ventures. They owned property in Italy and the Netherlands. Their wealth wasn't confined to Spain. When Spanish economists warned that importing everything while producing nothing was destroying Spain as economic foundation and strategic independence, the nobility ignored them. Because stopping imports and rebuilding Spanish industry would take decades, would require investment with uncertain returns, and would reduce the nobility's income in the short term. Meanwhile, the current system allowed them to live splendidly by importing the best goods Europe could produce. They chose personal wealth maximization over national economic sustainability. And when Spain declined, the nobility didn't decline with it. Their internationally diversified wealth protected them. It was the Spanish middle class, the artisans, small farmers, and merchants who were destroyed when Spanish industry collapsed and never recovered. Britain. British financial elites in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were sophisticated economic actors. They read the reports showing Britain was losing industrial competitiveness to Germany and America. They understood the long-term implications, but they responded by investing more overseas, not by modernizing British industry. Why? Because the financial returns justified it. Investing in British industry required dealing with labor unions, uncertain markets, and substantial capital expenditure with moderate returns. Investing in an Argentine railroad backed by British government guarantees provided secure returns with less risk. Investing in South African diamond mines offered spectacular returns. For a rational investor seeking maximum return, investing overseas made more sense than investing in British manufacturing. When Britain declined industrially, the British elite who controlled capital didn't suffer proportionally. Their wealth was internationally diversified. They owned assets worldwide. They could live comfortably in Britain, Switzerland, France, or anywhere their investments were located. The British industrial working class suffered. British manufacturing cities declined. British industrial employment collapsed. But the financial elite who could have invested in modernizing British industry but chose not to, remained wealthy. The Soviet Union. Soviet leadership in the 1970s and 80s knew the economic system was failing. The classified reports documented the problems in detail, but by that time, the Soviet elite had created mechanisms to extract personal wealth from the system even as it deteriorated. Access to hard currency bank accounts. Ability to convert rubles at favorable rates unavailable to ordinary citizens. Positions that provided access to imports. Connections that would later allow them to acquire state assets during privatization. When the USSR collapsed, ordinary Soviet citizens were destroyed financially. Pensions that had been modest but adequate became worthless due to hyperinflation. Savings evaporated. State employment disappeared. Millions fell into poverty. But the nomenklatura, the Soviet elite, converted their political power into economic power. They became the oligarchs who bought up state assets at absurdly low prices during the chaotic privatizations of the 1990s. They moved money offshore. They acquired assets outside Russia. The collapse destroyed the Soviet population economically. But the elite, who had seen it coming and did nothing to prevent it, who had actually accelerated it by prioritizing resource extraction over industrial modernization, positioned themselves to profit from the collapse. The pattern is brutal and consistent. The warning gets ignored because the people with the power to respond are the same people who benefit most from the current system and who have already positioned themselves to survive or even profit from its eventual collapse. They're not ignorant of the warnings. They're not blind to the risks. They're making rational, self-interested calculations. And that's why the warning always gets ignored. Not because it's wrong. Because responding to it would require short-term sacrifice from the people in power. It would require them to prioritize long-term systemic stability over short-term personal wealth maximization. And they've decided, consciously or unconsciously, that extraction and personal positioning is preferable to systemic reform that might not work and would definitely cost them personally in the near term. This is the mechanism that makes the pattern repeat across totally different cultures, political systems, and time periods. Human incentives work the same way whether you're a Roman senator, a Spanish duke, a British financier, or a Soviet Central Committee member. When you can profit from the current system and position yourself to survive its collapse, you have very little personal incentive to reform the system, even if you know it's unsustainable. Now let me show you where the United States is in this exact pattern. Because the warning has appeared. The same fundamental structural warning that preceded the decline of Rome, Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union. In 1950, the United States was the world's dominant producer. American factories produced approximately half of global industrial output. American manufacturing employed nearly 30% of the US workforce. America made steel, cars, aircraft, ships, machinery, electronics, textiles, chemicals. The world bought American products because American products were often the best available, and America was one of the few major industrial nations not devastated by World War II. By 1970, this was beginning to change. Manufacturing was starting to move overseas. Japan was rebuilding industrial capacity with more modern factories. South Korea was industrializing rapidly. Taiwan was becoming an electronics manufacturing center. American companies began outsourcing production to take advantage of lower labor costs. This seemed like rational business strategy. Profits increased. Stock prices rose. By 2000, American manufacturing had declined substantially as a share of employment. Manufacturing jobs fell from approximately 19 million in 1979 to around 12 million by 2000, even as the population grew significantly. Manufacturing as a percentage of GDP, which had been around 27% in 1950, fell to approximately 14% by 2000. By 2020, the transformation was nearly complete. Manufacturing employment had fallen to around 11 million workers, less than 8% of total employment. According to Bureau of Labor Statistics data, manufacturing's share of real GDP was approximately 11%. But what replaced manufacturing in the US economy? Services. Financial services, insurance, and real estate went from approximately 14% of GDP in 1950 to approximately 21% by 2020. Healthcare grew from approximately 5% of GDP to approximately 18%. Professional and business services grew substantially. Government spending as a share of GDP increased. The composition of the American economy fundamentally shifted. America makes less as a share of the economy and manages, administers, finances, and distributes more. Production has moved to China, Vietnam, Mexico, Bangladesh, Taiwan, South Korea, and many other countries. America increasingly designs products, finances their production, and sells them. But Americans don't manufacture most of what Americans consume anymore. And just like Rome, Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union before, this shift has made America wealthier by some measures in the short term. Why? Because outsourcing production to lower-cost countries reduces consumer prices. An iPhone costs $700 to $1,000 instead of potentially $2,000 or more if it were manufactured entirely in the United States with American labor at American wages. Clothing is cheaper because it's made in Bangladesh or Vietnam. Furniture is affordable because it's made in China or Vietnam. American consumers have benefited from low prices on imported goods. American corporations have benefited from higher profit margins by reducing labor costs. American investors have benefited from rising stock prices as companies became more profitable. The elite have become much wealthier during this transition. According to Federal Reserve data, the top 1% of Americans by wealth own approximately 32% of all household wealth as of 2023, up from approximately 23% in 1989. The top 10% own approximately 67% of wealth. The bottom 50% own approximately 2.5%. Stock market valuations have reached historic highs. American technology companies dominate globally in market capitalization. Many people point to this as evidence the system is working optimally. We're the wealthiest nation on earth, the argument goes. Our stock market consistently reaches new highs. Our companies dominate globally in innovation and market value. We don't need to manufacture everything. We're a knowledge economy, a service economy. Manufacturing is for developing nations. We're beyond that. This is word for word the same argument British leaders made in 1900 about evolving beyond manufacturing into financial services. It was wrong then. The question is whether it's different now. But here's the warning appearing in real time. The United States is now dependent on foreign production for a wide range of essential goods. Let me give you specific, verified data. Pharmaceuticals. According to the FDA and studies by the Department of Commerce, approximately 70 to 80% of active pharmaceutical ingredients used in drugs consumed in America are manufactured abroad. China and India dominate this production. For generic drugs specifically, the dependence is even higher, with some estimates suggesting over 90% involve foreign manufacturing at some stage. Medical supplies. During COVID-19, it became starkly apparent that the US had limited domestic production capacity for masks, gowns, ventilators, and other medical equipment. China manufactures approximately 50% of the world's masks and a substantial share of other medical supplies. Electronics. Almost all consumer electronics consumed in America are manufactured abroad. According to industry data, over 90% of smartphones, laptops, and similar devices are manufactured in Asia, primarily China, Vietnam, Taiwan, and South Korea. Steel. The US produces approximately 70 to 80 million tons of steel annually, but consumes over 90 million tons, according to the World Steel Association. The deficit is imported. For certain specialized steels, import dependence is even higher. Rare earth elements. According to the US Geological Survey, China processes over 70% of rare earth elements globally and over 90% of some specific rare earth processing. The US is dependent on Chinese processing for rare earths essential for electronics, magnets in electric vehicles, and military applications. Even military equipment has substantial foreign supply chain exposure. The F-35 fighter jet has components manufactured in multiple countries. Advanced semiconductors essential for modern weapon systems are manufactured primarily in Taiwan by TSMC and in South Korea. If access to these manufacturing centers were disrupted, US military production would face serious challenges. The warning is clear and documented. The United States has outsourced substantial production of goods essential for national security, public health, and economic function to foreign nations, including nations that are potential strategic rivals. But let me show you where the warning becomes most visible. The trade deficit. According to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, in 2023, the United States had a goods trade deficit of approximately $1.1 trillion. The US imported $1.1 trillion more in goods than it exported. How does America pay for this deficit? Not with exports of goods, since there's a deficit. America pays with dollars, with treasury bonds, with financial assets, with returns on past investments overseas, and with new borrowing. This works as long as the world accepts dollars as payment for real goods, as long as the dollar remains the global reserve currency that everyone needs and wants, as long as foreign nations are willing to accumulate dollar assets in the form of treasury bonds and dollar bank deposits. But if that changes, if the world becomes less willing to accept dollars in unlimited quantities in exchange for real goods, the United States faces an immediate crisis. America would need to either reduce imports dramatically, which would mean a substantially lower standard of living and potential shortages of essential goods, or increase exports dramatically, which would require rebuilding production capacity that's been offshored over 50 years. And here's why that's increasingly likely to change. The dollar's role as global reserve currency is declining measurably. According to IMF data on allocated foreign exchange reserves, the dollar's share has fallen from approximately 73% in 2000 to approximately 58 to 59% in 2024. That's a substantial decline of 14 to 15 percentage points. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have been explicitly working on alternative payment systems to reduce dollar dependence. China and Russia increasingly settle bilateral trade in yuan and rubles. India has been diversifying reserve holdings. The new development bank, created by BRICS nations, issues loans in members' currencies, not just dollars. Saudi Arabia, historically the anchor of the petrodollar system where oil was priced and sold exclusively in dollars, has been diversifying. In 2022, Saudi Arabia began discussing accepting yuan for oil sales to China. While the extent of actual implementation is debated, the mere discussion represents a significant shift from the 50-year pattern where all oil was dollar-denominated. The petrodollar system, where oil sales generated automatic demand for dollars globally, was indeed a cornerstone of dollar dominance. That system is weakening as major oil producers and consumers explore alternative arrangements. The dollar will not collapse overnight, but the trend is clear and measurable. Dollar dominance is declining. When the dollar loses a critical mass of reserve currency status, likely when it falls below 50% of global reserves, which could occur within 5 to 15 years at current rates, the United States will face a fundamental reckoning. America will need to offer something other than dollars in exchange for imports. That means either real goods, which requires production capacity, or accepting a dramatically lower level of imports, which means a substantially reduced standard of living. This is the warning, the exact same fundamental warning that Rome, Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union received and ignored. You've shifted from being a net producer to being a net consumer. You're dependent on imports for essential goods. You're paying for those imports with financial assets, in this case dollars and treasury bonds, that only maintain value because of your current dominance. When that dominance declines, as it inevitably must and is already beginning to, you'll discover you can't produce what you need and can't afford to import it anymore. And just like every empire before, American leaders and much of the elite are saying, this time is different. We're different. We're the indispensable nation. The dollar will always be the reserve currency because there's no alternative. We'll always be able to import what we need because the world needs our markets. Manufacturing is old economy thinking. We're a 21st century innovation economy. These are all assumptions that may prove correct, or they may prove to be exactly the same comfortable delusions that Roman senators, Spanish nobles, British financiers, and Soviet central planners told themselves while their empires hollowed out. The pattern suggests the latter. And here's the mechanism that suggests the warning will be ignored in America just as it was in 4 previous empires. The American elite have positioned themselves to survive a decline. Look at where American billionaires and the very wealthy are investing. Real estate in New Zealand, which has become famous as a refuge destination for wealthy Americans. Singapore condos, Swiss and other foreign bank accounts. Multiple citizenships through investment programs in Caribbean nations, European countries through golden visa programs, and elsewhere. According to various reports, wealthy Americans have been acquiring second and even third citizenships at accelerating rates. Companies like Henley and Partners that facilitate citizenship by investment report surging American demand. Wealthy Americans are diversifying assets internationally. Holdings in European, Asian, and emerging market stocks and real estate. Gold holdings, both physical and through financial instruments. Cryptocurrency holdings as a hedge against dollar devaluation. These are rational preparations for the possibility of dollar decline and the American economic crisis. American corporations have offshored not just manufacturing, but increasingly intellectual property and corporate structures. Many major American technology companies, while headquartered in the US, have complex international structures that allow profits to be held overseas and assets to be globally distributed. They see the warning. The sophisticated American elite are not ignorant of the risks of dollar decline, trade deficit unsustainability, and dependency on foreign manufacturing. But their response isn't to advocate for rebuilding American manufacturing at the cost of short-term profits. Their response is to personally diversify internationally and position themselves to survive whatever comes. Just like the Roman senators with estates across the empire. Just like Spanish nobles with investments across Europe. Just like British financiers with global portfolios. Just like Soviet nomenclatura who positioned themselves to become oligarchs. The people with the power to respond to the warning are the same people who benefit most from the current system and who have already positioned themselves to survive its potential failure. This removes the personal incentive to undertake difficult, costly reforms that might prevent or mitigate the decline. And that's why the warning is likely to be ignored, just like it was ignored 4 times before, not because Americans are uniquely foolish or short-sighted. Because human incentives work the same way in 2025 as they did in Rome, Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Now let me show you what comes after the warning is ignored, because the historical pattern is very specific about the sequence of events. Stage 1 is the warning appearing. Production shifts to imports. The elite concentrate wealth domestically and diversify internationally. Financial assets and services replace productive investments. This creates short-term prosperity that masks long-term vulnerability. This stage can last decades. Rome approximately 150 to 300 AD. Spain approximately 1540 to 1620. Britain approximately 1870 to 1914. Soviet Union approximately 1960 to 1985. United States approximately 1970 to 2025. The United States is currently completing Stage 1. The warning has appeared and is being largely ignored. Stage 2 is the crisis trigger. Something disrupts the system that the empire has become dependent on. Trade routes are severed, commodity prices collapse. A rival power emerges that can produce better or cheaper. Financial assets suddenly lose value or acceptability. Rome's crisis trigger was the 3rd century crisis, beginning around 235 AD. Civil wars, plague, and barbarian invasions disrupted trade networks. Suddenly, Italy couldn't reliably receive grain from Egypt and Africa. The empire that had outsourced food production discovered it couldn't survive prolonged disruption. Spain's crisis trigger was multifaceted. The Dutch revolt beginning in 1568 created a long, expensive war. English privateering and the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 weakened Spain's ability to protect treasure fleets. The 30 Years' War, beginning in 1618, was ruinously expensive. Silver production from American mines began declining after about 1640. Multiple disruptions hit simultaneously, and Spain, which had no production capacity to fall back on, entered terminal decline. Britain's crisis trigger was World War I, beginning 1914. The war required industrial production at unprecedented scale. Britain discovered that while it had financial wealth, it lacked sufficient modern industrial capacity. Britain survived the war but was fundamentally weakened economically. British industry never recovered its former position. The empire began its long dissolution. The Soviet Union's crisis trigger was the oil price collapse of 1986, combined with the unsustainable cost of the Afghanistan war and arms race. Soviet revenue collapsed. They couldn't afford imports. They couldn't produce consumer goods domestically. The economic system, already barely functional, completely seized up. Gorbachev's attempted reforms came too late and accelerated the collapse rather than preventing it. For the United States, the crisis trigger hasn't occurred yet, but several possibilities exist. A war or severe confrontation with China that disrupts trade and cuts off access to manufactured goods. Dollar losing reserve currency status relatively rapidly, making imports unaffordable. A debt crisis where foreign buyers of treasury bonds demand substantially higher interest rates or simply stop buying. Any of these could trigger the crisis phase. The timing is uncertain. It could happen in 5 years. It could happen in 15, but the structural vulnerabilities are in place. The US is dependent on imports, paying for them with financial assets, and that dependency creates fragility. Stage 3 is the collapse of legitimacy. Once the crisis reveals the empire's fundamental weakness, allies stop trusting security guarantees. Enemies act without fear of retaliation. The population loses faith in institutions. The elite's extraction of wealth becomes visible and generates popular rage. Rome, beginning around 400 AD. The sack of Rome by Visigoths in 410 AD. Multiple subsequent sacks. Provinces declaring independence. The Western Roman Empire formally ended in 476 AD but had effectively ceased functioning years earlier. Spain, approximately 1630 to 1650. Multiple military defeats, economic crisis, regional revolts including Catalonia and Portugal. Spain never recovered its great power status. Britain, 1945 onward. The empire dissolved rapidly after World War II. India, the crown jewel, gained independence in 1947. Most of the empire was gone by the 1960s. Britain went from superpower to middle-tier European nation in 2 decades. The Soviet Union, 1989 to 1991. Eastern European satellites left the Warsaw Pact. The Berlin Wall fell. Soviet republics declared independence. The Soviet Union officially dissolved December 26, 1991. From superpower to non-existent in 2 years. Stage 4 is the transfer of power. The empire that ignored the warning didn't recover its former position. Power shifts to whoever was building productive capacity, while the old empire financialized or hollowed out. Rome's power transferred eventually to the Byzantine Empire in the east, which maintained production capacity, and eventually to Islamic powers and European kingdoms that rebuilt productive capacity in the medieval period. Spain's power transferred to the Netherlands, which had built manufacturing and trade capacity, and to England, which was industrializing while Spain extracted silver. Britain's power transferred to the United States, the nation that had outproduced everyone industrially during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Soviet Union's dissolution transferred power to the United States initially and increasingly to China as China built manufacturing capacity. The pattern suggests United States power will transfer substantially to whoever is building productive capacity now. That's primarily China, which according to World Bank data manufactures approximately 28 to 30% of global goods. China produces over 1 billion tons of steel annually compared to America's 80 million. China builds more ships annually than the US by massive margins. Some estimates suggest over 100 to 200 times more commercial shipbuilding tonnage. China is doing what America did from roughly 1890 to 1950, building production capacity at extraordinary scale. When a crisis comes, producers have power. Consumers depend on producers. If the pattern holds, and there's no guarantee it must, but if it holds, power shifts toward China as American economic dominance wanes. The warning is clear. The pattern is clear. The outcome suggested by the pattern is clear. The United States is following a trajectory similar to Rome, Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union. The warning has appeared, and it's being ignored for the same reasons it was ignored 4 times before. The elite who have the power to respond are benefiting from the current system and have positioned themselves to survive its potential failure. So what does this mean practically? How should one think about this pattern? First, understand that patterns are not prophecies. History doesn't repeat exactly. The US could break the pattern. Reforms could be implemented. Production capacity could be rebuilt. Dollar decline could be managed more gracefully than past imperial transitions. These are all possible. But patterns are probabilities. When the same structural conditions appear repeatedly and lead to similar outcomes, that's information. It suggests what's likely, not what's certain. Second, the elite positioning for personal survival rather than systemic reform is not a conspiracy. It's rational self-interest operating at scale. When you can profit from a system and position yourself to survive its failure, you have little personal incentive to fix structural problems, especially if fixing them would be costly and uncertain. This is how incentives work. Understanding this isn't cynicism, it's realism. Third, the timeline is uncertain, but the direction seems clear. The US may have 10 years before crisis triggers. Maybe 15, maybe only 5. but the structural vulnerabilities are increasing, not decreasing. The trade deficit continues. Dollar reserve status continues declining measurably. Manufacturing continues moving overseas. These trends would need to reverse for the pattern to break. They're not reversing. Fourth, ordinary people cannot typically position themselves like the elite can. Most people cannot acquire multiple citizenships, cannot diversify wealth globally, cannot easily relocate internationally. Most people are stuck with the consequences of their empire's decisions in a way the elite are not. This is unjust. It's also reality. Understanding this doesn't fix it, but it clarifies what's happening. The pattern suggests that ignoring the warning leads to crisis, which leads to collapse of legitimacy, which leads to transfer of power. Whether the United States follows this pattern completely, partially, or not at all depends on decisions made in the next 5 to 10 years. But the warning has appeared. The same fundamental structural warning that preceded 4 imperial declines. Production shifted from internal to external. Elite wealth concentration increased. Import dependency grew while paying with financial assets whose value depends on continued dominance. The people with power to respond have positioned themselves personally to survive rather than committing to costly reforms. Rome ignored the warning. Spain ignored the warning. Britain ignored the warning. The Soviet Union ignored the warning. All 4 believed they were different, that old patterns didn't apply, that their dominance was permanent or at least long-lasting enough not to worry about. All 4 were wrong. The United States is at that exact decision point. Whether this time really is different depends on whether the warning is heeded or ignored. 2,000 years of history across 4 empires suggests it will be ignored. Human nature, elite incentives, and short-term thinking are remarkably consistent across cultures and time periods. The warning appeared. Every empire ignored it right before the collapse. The United States has received the same warning. History suggests what comes next. The only question is timing, and whether perhaps this time might actually be different after all. But the pattern says it won't be. The warning is being ignored, and the consequences of ignoring the warning are written clearly in the ruins of Rome, the decline of Spain, the dissolution of the British Empire, and the collapse of the Soviet Union. The warning was clear. It was always clear. And it was always ignored until too late.